Welcome to today's edition of our US briefing series, a series where we at the Böll Foundation in Washington, D.C. want to keep you apprised of the latest developments in the United States and share critical insights with our transatlantic audience. My name is Teresa Eder, and I run the Foreign and Security Policy Program here at the Böll Foundation. And today's event is titled Ties That Bind or Unwind, Transatlantic Interdependence and Trump 2.0. And we want to examine one of the most pressing challenges for European policymakers currently, which is the way in which the Trump administration threatens to weaponize the very economic, financial, and technological networks that have long bound Europe and America together. There's a lot of talk, obviously, about how much Europe's security architecture still to this day depends on the United States, but these dependencies exceed the military and security domain. And so some of the questions that we would like to answer today are how can Europe and the EU more specifically protect itself from Trump's most damaging policies? What leverage does Europe have against American tariffs, for example? And how might this administration further exploit these transatlantic interdependencies? And so I have the pleasure today to welcome Professor Abe Newman from Georgetown University, who will help us to understand the dynamics that are currently at play. And before we get started with the conversation, just a very brief bio of Abe Newman. He is the professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and he also serves as the director of the BMW Center for German and European Studies. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley, and his research focuses on the ways in which economic interdependence and globalization have transformed international politics. He is also the co-author of Underground Empire, How America Weaponized the World Economy. This is a book that I really recommend everybody reads, although you can't see it very properly right now. He wrote this book with Henry Farrell, and he wrote numerous other books. But the reason why I invited Abe Newman to talk to us today is because I think he and Henry Farrell really developed a very helpful framework that helps explain how America seeks to advance its national security through also dominating financial, economic, and digital networks. And so, Abe, I'm going to turn to you. You wrote this book back in 2023, or it was published in 2023. And I think it's fair to say that since the start of the second Trump administration, weaponized interdependencies and sort of the choke points that you talk about have only become more salient also in the geopolitical discourse. And so I'm obviously thinking about Trump's Liberation Day and tariffs that are used as a tool of coercion, but also export controls and semiconductors, digital platforms and how they're regulated, and the debates about swirling around AI and cryptocurrencies, and also the future of the dollar. And so for those who are not familiar with your framework, maybe you can help us understand and can give a brief introduction into sort of this global map of weaponized interdependence and how you see or have seen the US wield this leverage in the past. And then we'll get to sort of the present day.
Great. Well, first, Teresa, I just want to thank you for the invitation. And so let me just start and say, everybody somewhere in your brain, you have this picture of how globalization functions. And unfortunately, I think it gives you the wrong caricature, the wrong simple story. And that story is captured. Thomas Friedman had this book, The World is Flat, where he basically argued, as we create these networks for communication, finance, and production, that it's going to decenter power. It's going to decenter market interactions. It's going to sideline great power conflict, and that we're going to have a world where globalization is going to generate prosperity, and that'll go hand in hand with peace. And if you've been alive for the last, quick minute, that's not where we've been. We've been in a world where there's vulnerability as part of globalization. COVID, the Russia war, sanctions, surveillance, all of these things. So why is that true? And this is where Henry and my work really has focused. Is it makes two arguments, two simple arguments. The first is that the world is not flat. It's actually quite concentrated, very hierarchical in the economic structures. So if you take this device, if we can't find this, we basically start to Twitter. And it is run by one of two companies, Apple or Google, the operating system. The chip inside is one of two companies, TSMC or Samsung. And if you make a global financial transaction, it's going to route through a dozen firms in the world. And so that image, I want to, change people's mind and say it's not a world as flat, it's a world that's centralized economically, and that states, the US in particular, uses that structure to get leverage over its adversaries. And it does it either by surveilling them, learning about them. That was what was revealed in the Snowden revelations, that the network structure of information allowed the US government to monitor its adversaries, or it uses it to choke countries out of those central places, those central nodes in the global economy. And it does that, through export controls, sanctions, these efforts to isolate people from the ability to be part of these networks, which are so, if you can't be part of the network, you can't be a global company. And so if you want, we can talk more about when did this start and how has it evolved, but maybe I'll just stop there as kind of just an introduction of, why is the world so, why are we like feeling so uncomfortable is because the basic story we were told is not playing out. And it's this other story about economic concentration and then states taking advantage of that.
Why do you think it actually took so long to sort of shift this understanding, that globalization doesn't necessarily, lead to more cooperation and benefits all, and sort of that there is no coercion, well, that there is in fact this element of coercion that and leverage that is constantly at play? Why do you think this took so long? Was this just wishful thinking on part of policymakers, or yeah, curious.
So I think that if you talk to people from the global South who've experienced imperialism, they would not be surprised that markets are the site of power. That's just it is a part of our history and the reality. Markets are always a part of power. But we've lived in our most recent history through two kind of exceptional moments. One of them, the Cold War. In the Cold War, there was geopolitical rivalry. So the great powers were fighting each other, but there was no economic or very little economic interaction between them. So the East and the West were pretty much separated. So there was market interaction. It always had power implications, but it was confined within those blocks. Then you had the globalization period, the kind of the world is flat period, where there was no rivalry, no geopolitical rivalry, and it was muted in the face of, US basically economic and military dominance. And so people weren't really thinking about that. And we got told a story where markets are just about efficiency, the kind of, you might call it the neoliberal, kind of dream. But underlying both of those periods, markets were always being used for power. In our story, what really shocks the US government is 9/11. It's this moment where the US government realizes that markets are also about power, that these networks of globalization, communication, production, finance were turned against the United States, that terrorists use them to attack the homeland. And even though the United States is shifting how it thinks about these things, other countries, particularly the European Union, they don't want to give up that. There was so much wealth that was generated. It's difficult to say, well, okay, we have to give up some of that because of a desire for resilience. And if you just look at the founding documents of the European Union, the four freedoms, the Treaty of Rome, all of these things, the DNA of the European Union is constructed around prosperity through markets and openness rather than this idea of vulnerability.
Maybe let's move already to the present day, although we will go back obviously into history as well. I'm just wondering, when you look at the actions of the Trump administration currently, um, what's your analysis of their policies and actions? Are these loosening, degrading, or consolidating sort of the grip on America's choke points, in the different realms that we had discussed? Like, it seems to me, as an outside observer, that there are a lot of contradictions in their policies. And so my question would be for you, how do you assess at this moment? Obviously, things can change rapidly, but what are they pursuing with their different policies? For example, the tariffs that are used more as a bargaining chip than a real policy. Sort of how is that gonna erode maybe the U.S. economy over time? I'm curious what your assessment is at this current moment of what they're trying to do here.
Great. Well, that's a big question. It's also a very complicated question. Let me just start by saying I think the Trump administration is not a unitary actor. There's not a coherent decision-making process. It is the first principle of the administration has been to degrade and to dismantle the traditional national security decision-making structures. So in a typical administration, you would have like a kind of an agenda that would then be fed through an interagency process where all would be tasked to work on how to accomplish some goal. There is no national security advisor right now. I mean, it's Marco Rubio is playing is like basically he's another thing, so I think we have to just be honest with ourselves that this isn't a traditional decision-making process, and it is reliant on a bunch of factions that are almost headed by individuals that are fighting for the ear of the president, who makes quick decisions not really based on any kind of interagency, expert-based process. Okay, so that's the first thing, which means that you will have contradictory policies. You will have reversals. We've seen like almost daily of efforts because it's not going towards a consistent goal. I do think that there is also something that's very unique in this administration, which is there is a kind of, some people call it patrimonial objective, which is, bringing in resources for a small clique of actors around the president and his close allies, which makes the objective different than traditional national security, which we would see as, the state. So I think that for all these reasons, it's difficult to comprehend, but I think you can comprehend it if you start from this idea that it's not a traditional bureaucratic decision-making process. It's more an individual decision-making process. And the objective is not always collective interest, the national interest, but it is about these smaller circles of parochial interests. Why does that then create challenges for the kind of economic security or for understanding coercion? Because first, we move from the objective being to create national security objectives to, like you were saying, leverage. And so if you look at the Biden administration, it had this whole small yard, high fence idea about how it was going to compete with China over technology. You can disagree about whether you think that was a good or bad or effective or not effective, but it was using these tools, the economic coercion, in order to advance a clear objective of what we would think of great power rivalry. If you look at what has been done, let's say on the Trump trip to the Middle East, where he signed a bunch of agreements with the UAE and Saudi Arabia to create data centers in these countries, it's very hard to understand how that jives with that great power rivalry idea. These are a bunch of countries. They have relations with China. China could then get access to those data centers. It would undermine, as you're saying, US centrality in the AI ecosystem. But it's being done because it benefits NVIDIA. It benefits, the Trump family. They get a plane. As the president said, if somebody offers me a plane, why would I say no? So we're in a different world of like, what are the objectives? But at the same time, coercion is being used almost on a daily basis. So it it is difficult to say that it's not effective because we see countries and companies attempting to get out from under that coercive threat. But I think it's important to recognize the traditional objectives are not what are being pursued, but these other objectives. It doesn't mean you don't still have efforts at great power rivalry. Those factions that are competing include like a traditional China hawk faction, but they, I think, are less, powerful than they might have been, let's say, in the Biden administration, where they were quite dominant.
Maybe I can sort of ask you a quick follow-up on that. I mean, how would you assess this? Are the policies that the Trump administration is putting forth right now, are they eroding these type of choke points and sort of this network that the US has developed over decades? Or are they actually right now sort of causing the opposite, where a lot of countries are willing to, basically do whatever it takes to, play nice with Trump, give him this or that? Sort of how do you look at that specifically?
So I think there's a time frame issue in the short term. It is very difficult for many actors, both private and public, to decouple themselves from U.S. Hubs. Take the F-35 debate. It's this platform. Many countries in the world, our allies, have invested in this. It's like, in order for them to diversify from that, they would basically have air forces that were incompatible inside themselves with each other. So it's very difficult to think that in the short term that a country like Denmark would be able to disentangle itself from that. Similarly, if you look at cloud services in Europe, the dependence on US providers is almost complete market share. There's I don't know, like, I think it's 80%, US providers. So that's in the short term. But clearly, these actions are raising questions about the long-term viability of these dependencies in actors who would never previously have questioned these things. So Denmark, I think, recently announced they were going to stop using Microsoft systems in its government, operations. There, there have been back and forth within different factions in Denmark, whether they should continue the F-35 purchases. It looks like they will, because of the problem that I mentioned earlier. But even though it's just raising these doubts that previously would never have been raised. And so I think there's no doubt that these actions, they are not useful in shoring up US economic centrality in the world. And I mean, to be honest, the president has said he doesn't want that. His whole policy is to reduce countries' trade dependence with the United States. He wants things to be produced in the United States. At least that's the stated goal. So it is, tariffs will reduce leverage. I think there was also in the bill that is being proposed, the budget bill, it would put a tax on foreign investors in the United States. All of these moves weaken the ties of other both financial information and production ties to the U.S. economy. So I don't think that can in any way be seen as a way to shore up the U.S. centrality. That being said, it's not. It's the question is there a substitute for these economic key players? And in many cases, it's very difficult to see that in the short term. So for the US dollar, we can talk more about that, but the renminbi is not a convertible currency. It's not really an alternative to the US dollar. So it's hard, even though the Chinese, there was a kind of a press release yesterday that there was a meeting with Lagarde last week where, it was kind of like maybe there's some way to shift focus from the US dollar, but the reality is that there is not a deep liquid market for renminbi. So it's hard to see it as a real challenger, at least, in the near term.
And you just mentioned China, and I'm just thinking also about, who are the other actors and countries, China obviously being one of them, that can also wield control over choke points against the US. So China is a big one, but I'm wondering, since we have a transatlantic audience, does Europe possess any sort of choke point leverage at this point over the US and China? Or is it sort of fated to be at the mercy of these two powers fighting it out?
I mean, there's no doubt that that European firms play a central role in the global economy in many key sectors. So if you think about in technology, a company like SAP or ASML, in areas of finance, many of the global banks are European banks. And also in production, you have the same set of key players. I think the problem in Europe is less about the economic side. It is much more about the political and institutional side. So I had a piece with Agathe Desmarais for ECFR where we kind of argued about this, about the lack of institutional capabilities. If you just ask the question, who is responsible for sanctions in each member state? It's very difficult to figure that out. Okay. And it's from a European perspective. Like if you're sitting in Paris, who do you call to implement and enforce sanctions in Germany? It turns out that it's much more of like a bureaucratic agency in Germany where it's like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Treasury in France. And that just the lack of an organizational map really undermines Europe's ability to play in these spaces. And then, of course, there is just the mindset. Europe, I'm always, trying to shake my European colleagues. They're not bystanders. They have to be willing to be players in this world. If you think about the Russia sanctions, who froze 300 billion central bank assets of the Russian government? It was Europe. It was the European Central Bank. That is the largest act of economic coercion in modern history. And it was Europe that did it. It wasn't China. It wasn't the United States. But in that moment, I think Europeans still view it as, oh, well, we just did it because the US said so. Or, it's not seen as Europe has this capability and should be willing to use it. The conversation about the anti-coercion instrument, you hear over and over this idea that, well, it's just a deterrent and, we should never use this. Well, things that are never used are not a deterrent. That means they're just feckless. And so you have to be willing to use these types of tools in order to persuade your adversaries or your interlocutors that you're serious. And so I think that Europe has difficulty because its DNA is about openness, it is about liberalization, but it has to be willing to also engage in real deterrence. I think the other thing I just want to say on that is that Europe has an opportunity, not just in the place of sticks about coercion, but in the carrots. I think for example, the Mercosur conversation, or the effort to potentially join CPTPP. If the U.S. is just inward looking and spending the next decade, engaging in self-inflicted wounds, this is the opportunity for Europe to step up and say, we are committed to the global trading order and we are going to deepen it, and Europe will benefit from that. But that's why, once again, internal politics is so frustrating because you see France continuing to block, the Mercosur agreement, which in normal times might be okay. But this is like, we're beyond normal times. Like this is a make or break moment for Europe, and it really needs to think about how does it create a leadership role in the world. And I think that is through promoting openness and also being a stabilizer when crisis hits. When the next financial crisis hits, it's unlikely that the United States is going to be the lender of last resort. So I think actors like Europe or Japan, they need to work together to provide that and see themselves as that kind of players who are not just waiting for the US to act, but are going to act to be a leader in the world economy.
Thank you. I mean, there was a lot in there, and I just want to maybe tease out some of the different ways in which Europe and the US are so interdependent. I wanted to also, again, remind our viewers that you can also submit a question if you have them, many, just one or many more. I will make sure that we get to those at the end or in the latter part of this conversation. You touched on, you mentioned Denmark, who wants to move away from Microsoft using Microsoft software. And as I view it, I feel like, and you already mentioned this, there are many different answers as to how to deal with the US in this current moment. I mean, in the digital sphere, you also have talks in Germany to use more Palantir software, which is sort of going the complete opposite direction of what Denmark is trying to do. And I think a lot of the different sort of answers or reactions in Europe also are probably a result of sort of trying to figure out how viable their transatlantic relationship will be in the future. I think some in Europe might still be in this state where they're like, Trump is in his second term. Who knows what's going to happen in 4 years from now, and we can't afford to, basically I guess, de-risk from the US or basically put our foot down on certain issues that we really care about. And one of those, I think, issues in Europe and in the EU is digital regulation. And we've seen already threats from the Trump administration to basically not enforce the Digital Services Act, to not punish US tech companies. And I'm curious what your sort of, first of all, what would be your advice to the Europeans, especially the regulators, in sort of keeping and basically pursuing, not giving in to these threats coming from the US? And how do you see this play out in the future? Do you already see some waning in Brussels on sort of we should stay away from all these regulations because it's just angering the US? I'm curious about that.
So I think the first thing I would say is that we are seeing now a shift in conversation, I think, in Europe, where US dominance in technology or Chinese dominance in technology is not just an issue about level playing field and competitiveness, but it's also a national security issue. And I think that that's really important, that, for the last decade, the commission was really focused on trying to figure out how to crack open the anti-competitiveness question. And so if you think about the Vestager efforts, or, they were really focused on leveling the playing field. But if you look at what's happened in the last 6 months, it's really been a new narrative, one in which dependence is not just about market outcomes, but it's also about security. And so I think if you look at the speech that was given by Pedro Sanchez, Robert Habeck has also said similar things, that this dependency is not just about economic issues, but it is also about national security. And if you go back in history, this isn't brain science. It's like countries had ministries, PTTs, up until the 1990s, in which they regulated critical sectors like telecommunications because it was a national security threat. And so the idea that we should have foreign companies providing these services, that is a really new thing. And it is one that I think we should be skeptical about. It's not like random that the United States has been on a global campaign to limit Huawei, the Chinese telecommunication provider, in critical infrastructures because it's worried about these very systems. Okay, so that's the first thing, is that we're seeing in this new conversation. The second is that I think in Europe, there needs to just be a clarifying assessment that anything is possible. If there's one thing that COVID taught us, it is that you can switch things that seem unswitchable very quickly. My children were put into homeschool for 18 months. Nobody would have thought that would be possible. We started using this technology, Zoom, which allows me to have this conversation. We weren't using that. And this thing is not old. We do not need Instagram or Twitter or these things are all, we like them. They're fun. They are enjoyable. They do some things, but it's not that they are necessary for society. We've only had them for under 20 years. So I think the idea that we can't touch these things, we can't risk things, they could really, that is all part of a narrative that is created in order to maintain these economic structures which do make a lot of money. So, that is a thing to think about. But I don't think that we should think about we can't touch, these are third rails. These are actually quite new, and we need to think about what's best for our societies and how to protect them. The final thing that I would say, though, is about the US interaction over these questions with Europe. And there, I think it's both a question of creating tension with the United States, but it is also a question of, does this model work? Is it going to solve the problem? And that's where I think Europe needs to spend a little bit more time. The Digital Services Act is an important piece of legislation, but it does not address the fundamental dependence of European markets on Chinese and US companies. And so the question is do you need to think about this in a different way? And that's where I think there's a conversation in Europe around the Eurostack, which is a long-term, project, but it's an interesting conversation because it suggests the regulatory solution is not enough. There has to be also an effort to address the technology and have European providers. And yes, it might be less efficient than US providers. But I think the lesson of COVID, the lesson of the Russia war, the lesson of the current tariff leverage is that sometimes you have to be a little less efficient to protect yourself. I'm a big believer in globalization. And so I don't think people should be, moving to autarky. They shouldn't be, cutting off all ties with foreign countries or economies, but they need to diversify their systems so that they're not dependent solely on one provider. And that diversification might lead to increased costs, but it really shields consumers and governments from the type of coercive leverage that China is doing on rare earth metals or the US might be doing with tariffs.
You mentioned Eurostock, and I'm curious, how would you push back against sort of this notion that I feel like I'm hearing a lot that this is not a viable project, and we're too late in this, like we can't develop now that US tech is dominating sort of pretty much all different types of technology. We can't really carve out our own type of system, and especially looking to the social media platforms. And maybe on a quick side note, and curious your thoughts on this. Now that we've seen this falling out between Musk and Trump, it sounded like, yeah, the US will use sort of Starlink and X also as sort of a leverage to force the Europeans' hand on certain things. Do you see this now? Is this now a thing of the past? Does the US still have an interest in defending Musk's business interests in the rest of the world?
So I think the champions of Eurostack, I think they would self-describe themselves as a movement. It's not yet at the place where it is a tangible policy alternative. It is something that is trying to build awareness about dependence and then saying that we need an alternative. The idea that Europe cannot produce an alternative, I think, is just, it's ridiculous. This is one of the most economically advanced, technologically sophisticated regions in the world. Nobody expected Japan to outperform the United States in the auto industry. If you go back in time, people laughed when they said the Japanese are going, they're producing the next generation of automobiles. If you just say, though, well, we can never compete with the United States and this is a ridiculous, effort, well, then you will not ever compete with the United States and you will, it's like, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So technological change is not linear. You don't know where you're going to end up from point A to point B. We've seen things like the Chinese demonstration of DeepSeek. It's not as technologically sophisticated as US models, but would it perform many of the functions that people need in a world? Probably. So, Europe should not see itself as excluded from technological futures, but it does need to think it's capable of them. With the question of, I'm very skeptical that US government interactions with Silicon Valley are somehow now back to simple market interactions. Um, I think in particular in the Trump-Musk interaction, I'm not sure that that's really some kind of rift or even, I think it's still to be seen what that was, and how much of it was for public consumption versus real. But I think the bigger issue is that if you look at Amazon or even the major broadcast companies in the United States, they're all serving in a deferential position vis-a-vis the US government, and that could have global consequences. And so if you're in Europe, you should be concerned about that. And I think it's important for US companies to express that to their American partners and say, hey, if this isn't about markets and the rule of law, then that's going to have economic consequences for partnerships. And you've already seen that in the United States, where law firms that sign deals with the administration have lost clients because people are concerned that this is not impartial market interactions, but it is political.
I want to come back to an issue that I think is very prescient right now in Europe, which is sort of the heightened spending on defense. The NATO summit is coming up. We are expected to spend 5% of GDP on defense. We'll see when that actually happens. But the conversations that I see happening between the US and Europe on this is also well, the 5% is one thing, but the second thing that immediately comes after that is the US is asking Europeans to buy American weapons. And sort of, you touched on the F-35 earlier, and there is sort of there are probably very diverging views within Europe on whether or not this is really the time to build up the European defense industrial base and invest in European manufacturing of weapons and arms, or whether, as also again a sign of good faith, you go to the US and you buy there. So I'm curious if you had to advise the people that make decisions on this, how to think about this also in the long run, not just in the short term. What would you advise them to do?
Well, I mean, I've lived in Germany for many years, and I know this is a very difficult moment. The idea that Germany would engage in large scale military buildup. That being said, I am very concerned about the German economic model, about it's basically for decades been dependent on mechanical engineers building moving metal. And unfortunately, China has become better in many market domains at doing that. And so, for many of the largest German companies, they are under, I think, not a long term, but a quite short term economic threat. And that threatens the German business model. And so, in some ways, what people would call military Keynesianism, spending money to build weapons, is it is a solution to that problem in the short term. So I think it's not only an international question about the U.S. and Europe and burden sharing and whatever, but it is also a domestic question of what is the future of Volkswagen, and how does it get through the next 50 years. And so I think that will need to be addressed In terms of the burden sharing conversation, my sense is that this has gone beyond burden sharing because what Europe is proposing is not really to burden sharing traditionally was you spend more money and you buy more of US things. And the proposals right now are not that. And I think it is important when you look at the war in Ukraine, you need more European providers that can actually build these systems for these security threats. And there's no doubt that I think it was a Danish intelligence or Dutch intelligence. So that's going to show my lack of knowledge, but one of them arguing that Russia would be capable of an attack on NATO in a 5 to 10 year time frame. And so in that period, Europe has to have autonomous capabilities to produce weapons that are not just dependent on the United States. I think this could be a point of conflict with the United States, who will, the US government push back and say these can't have buy European provisions. And then I think the question is how much coercion is the US government willing to leverage in order to try to break Europe's resolve about that? And I don't think Europe is fully ready for that. And it really needs to, think through if the US were to sanction Europe in order to force by American provisions put into those, what would Europe do in response? So I think those conversations are uncomfortable, but are places that Europe needs to go to prepare for its own national security future.
You touched on it in the very beginning, sort of the surveillance part of it, which also somewhat connects to the intelligence gathering and intelligence sharing. I mean, that's another domain where what if we are in a different world and scenario where the US is actually not sharing intelligence with Europeans or bad intelligence? How do you think about that puzzle piece? Because it's another one where Europe has a lot to, invest in to be able to stand on its own feet.
Yes, I mean, there is no question that for the last several decades, European officials have often turned to US intelligence as the gold standard in trying to figure out their own foreign policy and national security objectives. And, I did a bunch of work after 9/11 where there were these agreements signed between the US and Europe, where basically Europe would give data to the United States and then the US would process it. And then Europe could ask the United States for data, because the US was better at sorting the data. It was also a way for Europeans to get around domestic privacy rules. But it just signals, I think if you look at it repeats itself in sanctions targeting, many different domains where Europeans are often dependent not just economically or militarily, but also institutionally on the US bureaucratic capabilities. But I think Europe has to recognize that US capabilities are being degraded internally. And so there is, the national security, national intelligence bureaucracies are being degraded. And at the same time, there could be political disagreement between the US and Europe to share that information. And we saw that in Ukraine, there was kind of these threats of like, well, we would stop providing intelligence information to Ukrainian military. And so it's just, unfortunately for Europe, it's going to cost money to solve these problems, and Europe has to be willing to do that. It is the reality that Europe and the United States benefited from a type of economic military bargain where the US provided the military protection and Europe did not need to invest in those sectors. And it could build its, domestic welfare state and infrastructure. And I think now it's the flip side of the burden sharing conversation. The burden sharing conversation, Europe needs to spend more money, but it also will have to be more independent, which is not really, I don't think, in the US interest, but that is what the administration is demanding.
I would like to zoom out a little bit. We received a question from Elias Binger, and he's asking, considering on the one hand the move toward a more multipolar world order with the BRICS and louder voices from global South countries, especially, for example, when we think about the war in Gaza. And at the same time, Europe's very deep dependency that we just talked about on the US. How do you see these sort of converging, these opposite shifts interacting, and sort of how should Europe also think about the larger world, and how can we adapt international relations while our economies still reflect this sort of unipolar structure that you discussed, or at least the bedrock of the transatlantic relationship.
So, I mean, I think it's really important for Europe to position itself as a leader, not just for Europe, but also to the global South, and to think of itself as that's an important goal that Europe should have. And there, I think it probably needs to be willing to make these types of sacrifices where sometimes it costs Europe money or resources to do it, but it is important because it builds these coalitions of support. And so, I'm the conversation over the Mercosur free trade agreement, I think, is an example of that, where it's, this is a clear case where it could build a tighter coupling with global South countries, but it is, yes, it is uncomfortable for French farmers. But it's, that's a kind of, it's not just about market access, but it is also about political linkages. I think I don't see yet a clear multipolar world, like in the sense of BRICS. I mean, I think there's many of those countries, I don't see them as really global players. I think we're still in a world where the US, China, and Europe are the main global players, and then there are these regional actors as well that try to either destabilize the system or promote the system, but they're not really. Sometimes in international relations, we call order-changing actors. I think the order-changing actors are really still these three largest economies and militaries.
Your answer also just got me thinking, like in sort of the global governance context, is it also possible to leverage choke points for the public good? So I'm thinking, for example, about, we're a green foundation, about climate change goals, having, for example, something like the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and sort of like, I think what I'd like to understand is this also something, the interdependence that can be weaponized for global goods, I would say.
Yes, there's no question that these tools can be used for a whole host of objectives. So the U.S. has the Global Magnitsky Act, which is using sanctions in order to undermine corruption and promote human rights. You have things like CBAM or the Deforestation Directive, that are using coercion in order to achieve these public goods. I think, though, it goes back to the last question, which is coercion without carrots is very difficult to maintain over the long term because it is viewed as coercion and just power. And I think we've seen very interesting interactions, let's say over the Deforestation Directive, where, countries like Indonesia have said, we understand what your objective is, but we view this as imperialism. You're basically, just undermining our economic viability. And so that's where I think, whether it's the United States or Europe, when we use coercion, we have to have how do we incentivize countries to do the things we want, where we're increasing the cost for them to do things, but we're decreasing the friction to get where we want them to go. And so those things have to go hand in hand if we're going to build coalitions that view these objectives as legitimate. Because ultimately, if they're viewed as illegitimate, you're going to get pushback, even if you think they're maybe for a good objective.
Mm-hmm. I think we're sort of moving to the end of our conversation, but one thing we haven't really touched on very much is the US dollar dominance. And this is one thing where I also really have a lot of question marks about what the Trump administration particularly is trying to achieve here, because he has advisors who advocate for devaluing the dollar. The dollar has been weakened since the tariffs have been enacted. And sort of, I just wonder what is the end goal here, and also how could this affect the US's ability to project power in other domains. So project power in a military sense, but also in an economic sense abroad if you have a weakened dollar.
Yes, I mean, I think in the short term, it's very difficult to replace the US dollar. And because it's not just used as a central bank asset. So it's not just, the Japanese central bank or the Chinese central bank holds dollars, but trade interactions are invoiced in dollars. So Japan buys something from Europe, it is often invoiced in dollars. And those then it creates this deep liquid market of US dollars. If that if we see that to start to corrode, that would be something that would be, in my mind, much more troubling for the future of the US dollar. As I said before, it's very difficult because there's currently no alternative. For China, they have capital controls. The renminbi is not a convertible currency. In Europe, the problem is that because of the lack of euro bonds, there is not a centralized market that is deep enough to allow for a facility around a euro version of a reserve currency. What I think is probably the most troubling, people often focus on the sanctions and yes, people don't like these things, but they're willing to put up with them because it solves an economic problem. Probably the most troubling for the US dollar as the central hub, choke point, is actually the push by the US government to promote cryptocurrencies, stable coins that could then be an alternative to the traditional dollar clearing mechanisms. And that's once again, I think it's parochial interests. There's no vision of the long-term maintenance of US centrality in the global economy. It's about some, factions that want to make money off of this thing. And I think if you were really to ask people in the bureaucracy at Treasury, they'd be quite concerned that this move could undermine that central position that the US dollar has.
I wanted to sort of get your last couple takes. If you had to give, I don't know, 3 to 5 recommendations to European policymakers on how to manage the relationship, the economic, financial, digital relationship with the US in the months and years coming, what are some bullet points you would give them? What is your call to action to European policymakers right now?
Okay, so the first thing I would just say is that this is like an apocal level moment of change. We had a system that was run for about 100 years, and we're seeing a new system. So we need to think everything's on the table. This isn't a moment of minor tweaks. We have to really be willing to take bold action and to think about what is in the best interest of our countries, and we can't rely on the old stories to suffice. The second thing is that Europe has all the makings of what I would call an economic security superpower, but it needs to have the institutions and the willingness to use those tools. And so, like I mentioned in this piece with Agathe, we lay out kind of how would you create the institutions that you would need to actually run this type of organization, but you also have to self-identify as this type of actor. You have to see yourself as powerful and able to play. And then the third thing I would say is that Europe has the opportunity to lead in the global economy, and that's through sometimes people call it run faster, openness actions, the Mercosur Agreement, CPTPP, but also providing the type of platform to prevent escalating economic crisis. There's going to be financial crises, trade crises that result from US trade tariffs. So Europe should be in the position to then help stabilize those in a country like Bangladesh or Argentina, or you can't just rely on the US to provide those types of actions. And then my final point is with the United States in particular. I think Europe has to just understand that it needs to see its own interests and stand up for those. I don't, there's no quick deal that's going to make this go away. It's a long-term change in the global international order, and Europe has to be ready to assert its interests and stand up for them.
Well, thank you for those. I always like the fact that our American colleagues and friends are the ones pointing out that Europe should be more proactive, more, forward-leaning on different policies, and sort of keeping their own interests in mind and not always waiting for the US to take the first step or for the US to back down on something. So thank you for those calls to action. We are almost at the end of this event. I just wanted to remind our audience that we will have shortly a survey displayed. We also want to know what you took away from this conversation. And before we see the survey, I wanted to say thank you to Abe again for taking the time and sharing your insights and expertise with us. I think it's always very, for me at least, very enriching and sort of wrapping my head around what's going on, because there's so many things happening all at once, and to make sense of that. And then lastly, I would also remind the audience that we will have another US briefing coming up in July. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, I hope you have a good rest of your day. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks again for having me.